as Brent said, this is the last of the 6 sessions that we've done. So I know many of you have been here with us from the beginning. So appreciate your commitment to the topic and to this series for being with us through all 6 of those sessions. And if we were able to give you a merit badge for your commitment, we would do so. But we appreciate you being here with us. So today's topic we're going to get into are the solar ready requirements and a couple other things surrounding that that are in the 2024 RBES. And as Bryn said, we'll have plenty of time for questions. I have content on this that is direct to this topic. It is not a major component of the code update, so we will have plenty of time, I think, for questions, both on this subject and then anything else surrounding the code or anything relating to compliance with the code. So don't be afraid to ask some questions as we move through this today. So just out of the gate, we will acknowledge that the content that we're referencing here is copyrighted by the International Code Council. The International Code Council is the national organization that publishes all of the standards and model codes for the construction industry. And our Vermont Residential Building Energy Standard is Vermont's version of the International Energy Conservation Code. So the full content of the code is published by ICC, and just acknowledging that fact here. So just a quick summary out of the gate of what brings us here to this step here today and to the implementation of the updated code for next week. Historically, the Vermont Energy Code has followed the path and pattern of the updates to the International Energy Conservation Code, which is updated on a regular cycle. So here in Vermont, we have typically updated the energy code on a 3-year cycle. That has ebbed and flowed in regard to the actual number of years between the updates based on the process and feedback that comes from the industry. So what our energy code represents is the most recent version of the International Energy Conservation Code, with content and components that are specific to Vermont's climate zone, and then more and more these days to our climate policy and energy policies here in Vermont. So this work is done through under the oversight of the Public Service Department, which is the state agency which administers the energy codes here in Vermont, both the commercial and residential codes. Public hearings go into play through the update process and contribution from the industry. So all of that work was primarily done in 2022 and wrapped up in 2022 with the drafts of the updated code coming out in 2023. There was a delay in implementation based on feedback last year, and there was a legislative committee appointed in the previous legislative session that met during 2023 and contributed some more feedback to the code, and that put us to our implementation date here of July 1st. So that is coming up next week. There is still further conversation happening and will be happening again prior to this upcoming legislative session for 24-25. So there's more conversation being had around the impacts of the energy code, and further conversation around the process for the updates. So that'll be occurring, and something to be aware of through the remainder of this year and again into the next year's legislative session, if you have anything you want to contribute to this process, because it is a open and public process that you can contribute to. So putting that out there for context. The documents for the updated code. So we are being made aware that we do not yet have the handbook or the ICC published documents ready at this point. So the handbook is a document that is published in conjunction with the Department of Public Service with Efficiency Vermont support and helping to update the content. And the handbook is something that you're commonly aware of, that Efficiency Vermont makes available both as a digital copy and then as a print copy, and we mail those out to people who request them. So that handbook is still being wrapped up, and that work is still being done to have the 2024 version available. It is not yet ready. Anticipating it being ready in the weeks ahead. The full code content itself, published by the ICC, is not yet published and available on their site. So the full code language document is not yet available, and we do not have a certificate yet. So, but what is available are the documents of the draft, the final rules document that was approved by the Legislative Committee on Administrative Rulemaking, which is the entity that approves amendments to statutes, and the Vermont Energy Code is a statute law here in Vermont. So in these links here, the bottom link on the on this slide is the link to that approved statute amendment. And then the link here in the middle is basically the edited version of the 2020 Vermont RBES with the new content for 2024 included in it. So those are the documents that are publicly available at this time. As soon as we have the updated final versions of both the ICC published code and the handbook available, we will be doing a big round of outreach on that, and we'll have at a minimum the PDF digital copy of the handbook available probably first out of this. So, but if you do want to take a look at the full documents that are available, these are the links through the Public Service Department that you can access them from. So what I'm going to be talking about today, and most of everything that we kind of get into as far as the meat of the code, is contained in Chapter 4 of the ICC document. So Chapter 4 provides all of the guidelines and standards of compliance for new construction and additions, and the content relating to solar-ready requirements are going to be contained in this section of the code as well. So there are 3 compliance options that are available. Prescriptive compliance, which is what's been called the packages plus points approach, which has been in the code for a while, and what the change was made in the 2020 code to be a prescriptive package compliance and then earning points based on the square footage of the home. So that is the most commonly available and approachable compliance pathway for the code that most builders and professionals in the industry are aware of. And then there are 2 energy modeling approaches available to comply with the code as an alternative to the prescriptive path. One of them is using the ResCheck energy modeling tool, which is a online, I'm sorry about the forwarding on my slides here. I did not uncheck a box in PowerPoint before I started here, so I may be having to go back a little bit here and there. ResCheck is a energy modeling tool that is web-based and available from the U.S. Department of Energy, and that is a kind of builder and architect, open source sort of tool that you can access and use to model out the building envelope components and do a comparative analysis to a code compliant home as an alternative to the prescriptive compliance pathway for the energy code. And then the third option is using a third-party HERS rater to do a full building energy model that takes into account operational energy as well. A much more granular and deeper dive into the performance of the building as a whole that does account for mechanical equipment, air tightness, and other components of the building into the comparative analysis for compliance. So those are our 3 options for compliance. What we're going to be focusing on here today is the content as it relates to the prescriptive compliance pathway and to stretch code. So the prescriptive compliance pathway is, what we've always known it to be, has been a table that has multiple packages available to choose from in the 2020 code. There are 5 packages that you can choose to comply with. For the 2024 code, the prescriptive package table has been combined into one table with 2 packages. And also for this time around, we're going from having 2 different prescriptive tables in the code, one for base and one for stretch code compliance. The tables are combined into one for the 2024 code. So the way this works again is you pick which package, which essentially is already done for you, and you'll see that in a moment. that you want to comply with, and then you have to earn points in it for additional efficiency measures that is based upon the square footage of finished conditioned square footage of the home that you're building. So the bigger the home, the more points you have to earn. So again, this is the table that exists in the 2024 code. This table is going to be removed. And then this is the table that you will see for 2024. So that's technically there are two packages, but that second package basically is just the standard allowance that's been in the code for log homes, and log homes have their own ICC performance package that needs to be followed if you will be building that type of structure. Otherwise, it's essentially a single package to choose from or to comply with, we'll put it that way, for prescriptive compliance. So as you can look at the table here, and I thought I put this package, unfortunately, is not accurate. I had to, I thought I had already replaced this in the slide. So the one thing that is inaccurate on this right now is the window value here. The window value for 2024 is 0.30, not 0.27. The other values here are accurate, so I apologize for that. It's an oversight. I'll correct this before this gets put up on the website as a recording. But these are the minimum performance compliance requirements for the different building envelope components. You can see some things have moved in different directions. We have comparatively some lower R values for flat attics and slope ceilings comparatively to package 4 of the 2020 RBES. Which is kind of the standard package most builders have used. And we have some higher foundation and slab insulation requirements that are coming into play of R20 from R15. The window value, as I just noted, had been originally proposed to be a 0.27 U factor or U value. The window U requirement for 2024 is actually 0.30. So air leakage is now going from 3 ACH 50 to 2 ACH 50 and also being evaluated as CFM per square foot of building envelope area of the building shell. So it's just a different way of using the blower door data to evaluate air tightness for the building. As we've talked about in previous sessions, we're looking at the compliance requirements here for building envelope components as U factors now in this table versus R values. So we're not going to get into what the difference is there today. We do have some info on that in previous sessions that I've done that's recorded, but something we'll be talking more about as this code goes into effect. The points table also has been combined. There's no longer two separate points tables in the code for base and for stretch. They're combined under this single table you see here. And the points requirements for stretch code have increased from 2020. And our base code points requirements are essentially the same. The code had been iterating towards continuous insulation as mandatory for above grade walls, and the U factors in that table I just showed you are kind of iterating towards that as well. There will be a cavity only above grade wall option available in the 2024 code. And if you are going to be building a cavity only above grade wall, you will be required to earn an additional 5 points for doing that versus doing continuous insulation. And those additional 5 points would come into play on top of what you see here as the points requirements in this table per square foot. So something to be aware of and more of something to be talked about as we put the code into practice.
Steve, a question came in. Are there any requirements for sub-slab insulation in a basement other than when using radiant heat?
Technically, no. No is the answer. There is not a mandatory requirement to do any insulation under a slab that is either not heated and below grade or essentially that scenario. Because if you do have a slab that is on grade, or if it's a walkout basement, that is considered to be an exposed and on grade slab that would need to meet the minimum insulation requirements. But if you do have, a standard, 8-foot basement, 8-foot foundation walls down to a footing, and the footing is 5-6 feet below grade, and it's not a heated slab, that is not needing to be insulated underneath. That being said, I would definitely recommend putting some measure of insulation underneath that slab, as well as a very good vapor barrier. Both of those things will keep that slab dry and keep moisture from accumulating in the home, and also help condition that space a little bit better. So it's not a mandatory requirement, but certainly something worth considering. So the points table in the 2024 RBES has expanded significantly than what is available in the 2020 RBES. This is iterating towards some things around specifically to better performing building envelope components. So there's ways to earn points for higher performing walls, windows, and roofs. There are definitely high point values associated with all electric heating and cooling options. So whole house electrification is definitely a prioritized measure for earning points in the points table. And taking into account embodied carbon and some operational energy comes into play in the points table as well. And that is specific to our topic today of the solar ready requirements. So this is an example or just some screenshot of what the points table looks like for 2024. I don't expect you to be able to see this in detail or read it, but just essentially there is a lot to choose from here comparatively to what we have in the 2020 code. So bucketed around building envelope, mechanical ventilation improvements, heating and cooling systems, domestic hot water and water use in the building, and then other measures, including modeling, battery storage, lighting controls, taking into account embodied carbon in material choices, specifically insulation materials, and then renewables. So renewables there's a couple different pathways to earn points with renewables in the code, which leads us into what we'll be talking about here for solar ready requirements. So initially, there was a mandatory requirement in the first draft of the updated code for solar ready design as a minimum. So you were going to be required to show that there was, if not renewables installed at the time of construction, capacity for them to be in place easily at a future date. Those same general requirements that defined that criteria are in the code, but the difference in what you'll be required to meet as of July 1st is that those solar ready design standards are optional for base code. So they're an option to earn points prescriptively in the base code. So if you're using the prescriptive compliance option to comply with the code, you have to earn points. If you do solar ready design, you can earn 2 points for meeting the requirements that are defined in the code for a solar ready design of that building. If you need to meet stretch code, these requirements are mandatory. So everything I'm going to share with you here in the slide ahead, again, are going to be considered optional for points for base code, mandatory if you need to meet stretch code. If you do have photovoltaics on site and in use, you can earn points that way as well. So you can earn 1 point for every 1.5 kilowatt of production of the panels for that building to a maximum of 4 points. And then solar hot water is back in the mix here as well. So if you have a solar hot water system as a part of the home, you can earn 2 points with that. So just to define the definition or a alternative or the, what am I trying to say here? Difference between complying with stretch code and base code. If you do come into a situation where you need to meet stretch code, which is a higher standard of performance than base code, a more stringent requirement to be met than base code, you will need to follow the points requirements that are in the table, the prescriptive table, beyond what's in there for base code. So you'll need to earn more points. And stretch code comes into play if you're either building in the town of South Burlington, which South Burlington has adopted stretch code as their local requirement, as a higher standard of performance than base code. or if you are working in a project or on a project that is under the jurisdiction of an Act 250 permit. So a lot of developers, this is a factor into their work. So there are other towns in the state that have considered or are still in consideration of adopting stretch code as their local higher standard of performance. But at this point, South Burlington is the only municipality in the state that has adopted it as a mandatory requirement for construction. And one difference to be aware of too is that if you are required to comply with stretch code, your compliance options are limited to the prescriptive pathway, which we've just been talking about, or working with a HERS rater. You are not allowed to use ResCheck as a compliance option for meeting stretch code. So let's talk about what the solar ready requirements are. So what I am going to be sharing with you here in the slides ahead is essentially what is in the code, in the ICC code verbatim, and the different sections that reference the solar ready requirements. This is information that has been gathered from a variety of resources as far as the supporting content to this. I don't have much other guidance to offer to you around deeper definitions on this, but what I've pulled from is content that is available, kinds of national standards that would align with what you'll see here in the slides ahead. So just putting that out there as a disclaimer as far as content goes. So we've just touched on this about the difference between base code and stretch code and where these solar ready requirements would come into play. But one point to make for stretch code is that for new detached 1 and 2 family dwellings and for multiple single family dwellings, townhouses, not less than 600 square feet of roof area and a specific orientation. So this is the where it would come into play, because there are some exceptions that are allowed for in this section of the code for where you would not need to meet those solar ready requirements. So these are those exceptions. So if you already have PV on site, you don't need to be solar ready. You're already solar done. So that's a pretty obvious one. And some of these other, exceptions are perhaps a little gray, depending on what is intended to be a building designed with the intent of having solar in place or being ignorant of that, I guess we could call it. But so there are some allowances here that call out for an area where the roof area, presumably where the panels would be located, is not conducive for solar panels based on the topography of the site and shading. So that is an exception that buildings that show in the construction documents do not meet the conditions for a solar ready zone. So, I mean, the whole idea of a solar ready zone here really is to site and design the layout and orientation of the building to maximize its potential for PV. And so these exceptions kind of do seemingly open the door to allow for not doing that. So again, I'm just sharing with you what is in the code verbatim, and I think we'll be seeing more interpretations of this as we move through the next few years ahead. This also does allow for ground mount systems. So you can meet the requirements for solar ready by just defining in your construction drawings where a ground mount system would be versus having a specified and defined square footage area on a roof with the appropriate orientation to meet those requirements for solar ready zone. So section R402.7.2. construction documents. So the intent here is that what will be defined as your solar ready zone and the other components of requirements that relate to that would actually be showing up on construction drawings and be able to be followed and defined on those construction plans. So the intent here is that anything that I'm going to be sharing with you in these sections ahead that come from chapter 4 would be easily identifiable and clear on a drawing plan set to meet the intent of this solar ready zone requirement. So these are the actual standards of what is considered a solar ready zone area. So not less than 300 square feet per dwelling. And then total of 2,000 square feet per dwelling should have a solar ready zone of not less than 150 square feet. So, calling for a smaller the home, the less square footage is allowable for that zone. 40% of the roof area minimum calculated as the solar ready area. So I guess you just have to look at your roof area and the design of the building based on square footage to understand where you fall within these minimum requirements to define that area. Another option, again, as just noted a moment ago, would be to define the solar area as a ground mount system versus a roof mounted system. So these are just some of the definitions that are in this section of Chapter 4, defining what those minimum requirements are going to be for square footage area, depending on the size of the building and the typology of the building. So if you are going to be using ground mount system as an alternative to a roof mounted system, where that system will be sited on the property would need to be indicated somehow and somewhere on the construction drawings as well. So as a definition of a solar ready zone, this means that it's an area that's free of obstructions and maximizing the potential of the panels that would be installed in this area. The idea of not having any on-site trees or other things shading that section of the roof for a substantial portion of the day and or year. The orientation of the building obviously having an impact on this. So these are all the things that are kind of defining what the solar ready zone would be. How this then relates to those exceptions, I think, again, are going to be something that will be playing out as this goes into effect. Then we get into some specifics about what makes not just the solar ready zone for the area where the panels would be installed at a future date, but there are also requirements in this section that define connectivity access to that solar ready zone, whether that is on ground mount or roof mounted. There are requirements that you'll see in Chapter 4 here that define accessibility and infrastructure in place to allow for easy installation of that photovoltaic system at a future date. So if it is a roof mounted system, what it is requiring here is essentially that there's a conduit that goes from that roof area down to where the mechanical room of the home would be located. So essentially a easily accessible access point and pathway to get from the panels to the electrical panel itself and where the inverter would be located. So there are minimum requirements here that you can see around what the components of that connectivity pathway would look like. There are resources online you can pull from that kind of give you construction details to put these together. So this is just an example of some of details that are available on how to put through a roof penetration for a conduit that is flashed appropriately and meets the minimum requirements to hit this requirement that is shown in Chapter 4. This also takes into account the fact that there would need to be some accounting for the fact that you'll have these panels on the roof from a structural standpoint, so that structural load requirements are met for the weight of those panels to be put on a roof at a future date. So this is something to be taking into account if you do need to meet these requirements, if it comes into play for you in a new build that you're doing with your truss manufacturer. So if you are doing a trussed roof, you need to be taking that into account, and your documents would need to show that the roof is capable of carrying that capacity in the future. If you're doing standard dimensional lumber rafters, then usually that is not an engineered system as we see for residential construction. So I think that's to your discretion how to define whether or not the structural assembly has accounted for those loads. And you can, you account for those loads by doing load calculations for dimensional rafter assemblies This is just essentially asking you to show the math as my interpretation of it here in the code. So interconnection pathway, kind of going from that slide I showed you a moment ago, was kind of some standards around how to properly penetrate the roof and put the conduit in place and flash that appropriately for a future date. This section here defines in a little bit more detail the interconnection pathway. So the conduit and access points to the mechanicals in the mechanical room that will allow for running your wiring and other communications cabling through that conduit at the future date, and defining the location of where those components of the connections for the solar system would be located in the mechanical space as well. This then switches us into the needs of the panel itself. So there needs to be a section or space made available and clearly indicated in the panel that will allow for future connectivity for solar panels. So taking that into account in your load analysis for the electrical system, how big of a panel you will need and what sort of capacity you need to account for that future connectivity. Similarly, you need to account for where the components of the solar system or the PV system would be sited within the mechanical room. So usually you'll see the inverter for a PV system located in the house and in the basement or wherever the electrical panel is. So you'll need to account for that and identify on your construction documents where that future equipment will be located, and meeting these minimum requirements as far as setbacks and square footage of area to be locating the equipment. There is some stuff that comes into play here with the International Fire Code to be aware of as well. So I think, for all of this, really, if you are not going to be putting a PV system in place, I think it is still worth engaging with a solar installer. They can really be the ones that can navigate through you these standards and codes of practice that need to be followed for siting these things, and could probably give you the information that you would need to document on your construction drawings to show compliance with this section if you put this into use. So documentation of the capacity for this in the home at a future date. So similar to what's been in the code for a while as far as posting the actual RBES compliance certificate in the home. And that's usually been defined as being in the mechanical room and on or near the electric panel. This is now calling for a similar requirement for indicating the solar ready zone and the pathway for compliance with those requirements posted somewhere within that mechanical space as well. There's not a separate certificate that's been developed for specific to the Vermont RBES to define that or document that. So what I have found, and is a potential reference point to use, would be the Department of Energy Zero Energy Ready Home PV checklist. So this is a Department of Energy program. A fair amount of content that is in our energy code, and especially with these updates, has been orienting towards the mandatory objective that we have in the state based on the Global Warming Solutions Act of zero ready or net zero ready design and construction for our residential buildings coming up in the years ahead. So the standard of a net zero home has not been defined out of different methodologies that can be used to define a net zero home. But this checklist is available from the Department of Energy, and Department of Energy does have a more robust standard, as you can see here, their Zero Energy Ready Home program. So this is something that I've researched and pulled up that could be something you could be using to document these requirements for a solar ready zone as defined here in the code. So this is a checklist that kind of comes into play with 3 different conditions to be met. And then this part of that checklist actually defines some of the things that we've just been talking about in the code in chapter 4. So this would be potentially a certificate and way to show and document in the home the compliance for a solar ready zone. This would be, again, in conjunction with and on top of what you would be documenting in the construction drawings as well, for those sections that I just shared with you. So as we move through the specifics for solar ready requirements, there are requirements for electrical service that come into play here as well to support the capacity of not just PV, but, you know, as I noted in the points options earlier, that the code is orienting towards whole home electrification and heat pump, whole house heat pump systems. So accounting for that, this is a mandatory requirement for the code in general, for both base and stretch code, is that any building that falls into the category of needing to meet RBES is required to now have a minimum of a 200 amp electrical service to that home or dwelling unit. And just this comes into play with multifamily or duplex type situations of separate electrical meters being called out specifically. Then there are some other things that are showing up in the code which have not shown up before in the section I label as potpourri. And I do not yet know the origin of how requirements for electrical transformers have showed up into the code. I would have to do, I did some asking, but did not get any direct answers. And I'm not sure if this is following from the International Energy Conservation Code or if this is just something specific here for Vermont. But there are now minimum requirements for electrical transformers in the code. So this is not something that I think most of us are following or aware of, but something to be talking to your electrician about if you want to be showing compliance with this section. So I'm just sharing with you here content that is new in the code and something that you'll see if you look through it. And if you have questions on this, you want to understand the implications of these requirements, I would I would first talk to your electrician and just get their feedback on this and see what it means as far as any considerations for equipment going into the home to meet the requirements of this section. There is a component that does come into play for both base and stretch code, which is EV charging. So there is a minimum requirement of having at least one EV level 2 charger capacity site located in a single family home. So if you basically what this means is that you need to have a breaker and dedicated outlet that is capable of supporting a level 2 charger in a single family home. You do not need to have the charger in place for base code, but you do need to have the capacity for one to be put in place at a future date. If it comes into multifamily buildings, you are required to have a percentage of the parking areas available to have level 2 charging. And there is also requirements for minimum actual sockets that are in place for EV charging when you're talking about multifamily and for stretch code. But for base code, you basically just need to have the capacity and a dedicated circuit available for that somewhere near where a vehicle would be, garage or outside or overhang, something of those lines. And then finally, one other component that shows up in the code this time around, which has not been there before, is a definition of tiny houses. And tiny houses have been called out as their own building typology, separate from the categorization of single family residential construction. So this is an allowance for homes that meet that standard of being considered a tiny home, that there are lesser performing or different component values for the building envelope and for building envelope mechanical ventilation. So just calling this out, if this is something that is still out there on your horizon or you're being asked to build, is it's just a different standard defined for tiny houses from single family residential. So that gets us through solar ready construction. Like I said, we have some time here. I have some other slide decks pulled up from previous sessions. Happy to take some time to walk through anything that's of concern, priority, questions that have come up, not just on this topic, but from past sessions that we've done, or just the code in general, building assemblies or systems, mechanicals, et cetera, how they come into play for the code. So happy to take the next 15 minutes here of your time, or not, it's up to you, but to just kind of close us out with an open Q&A based on what we've been sharing here over the past few months. So feel free to either raise your hand or throw questions into the chat, and we'll take it from there.
Thanks, Steve. Great content. Definitely want to get some questions in here, make this of most value to you, to each of you. Bill, you should have permission to talk.
Hi, this is Bill.
Hi, Bill.
Hey, Bill.
I'm curious about hearing about municipalities that are forbidding solar installations because of excuses about their infrastructure, meaning their wires and transformers. Is there any state policy or forward looking for helping these municipalities make solar possible?
That lands into an entirely different, regulatory bucket than I think we have any direct answers for you on that, Bill. Yeah, I mean, I guess that's the best answer I can provide. I don't have any further insight to offer on that. That would be worth sharing.
Understood. How about off-grid installations? Are they covered in these regulations?
I think off-grid kind of just puts you into a necessity standpoint rather than an optional compliance standpoint for this, right? So I think if you're talking about an off-grid installation, then you're defining and building out capacity for what the actual usage will need to be for that building versus what the code's defining here as solar requirements. I think, this is the way that it's defined as I'm reading it here is that, this is capacity for partial load build out for PV in the future. These standards don't really align with, the intent of designing a solar system to take on the full capacity of a building to make it that quote unquote net zero. I think you're looking at a lot of factors that come into play to be able to size a PV system large enough to meet the full demand of a building that go well beyond what is coming into play here for those minimum, areas of exposure and square footage based on the size of the building. So if you're heading down that path, or that's an objective goal for the client on the project, then you're going to be working closely with a solar designer to make sure that you're maximizing the potential of the siting of the building and or the site work itself to allow for the right size system to be installed now or in the future.
Thank you, Steve. Thank you, Bryn.
Thanks, Bill.
Yeah, thank you, Bill.
We have a question that Bruce thought he saw a slide requiring a 2x2 inch PVC conduits for roof array. Do you recall anything about that, Steve? Do you remember what that's for?
That may have just been a discrepancy in what I shared as an example for a construction detail versus what the code language actually calls for. I think what's specific in the code is 1.25 inch conduit. So I go off of what the actual code language is versus what I've shared there as far as the images for supporting this. But that is what I know is written in there, 1.25 inch conduit.
Okay, that's helpful. Looking at some other questions. There's, going back to some older content, questions, why don't log homes need significantly improved performance numbers? for everything like beyond walls?
Well, that's because there's an ICC, IECC, Energy Conservation Code standard that's specific to log homes, and that's been in the code from the outset. There is a table that you will see in the code that defines the building envelope component values in specifics as you'd see it for a standard stick built construction. It'll have the component values for ceilings, roofs, walls, etc. So there is a prescriptive table that shows up that is just drawn specifically from that ICC standard for log home construction. Looking at that, I don't know if it has a different standard of performance for, say, windows or ceilings or roofs because of that certain building typology of log homes. But yeah, it is what it is. It's been that way since the beginning. And, it's a small subset, I think, of the overall housing stock, but the allowance is there for it.
Great, thank you.
So I'm seeing a question here from Kate.
Yeah, but it's just about certificates of attendance.
Oh, I see. Got it. Okay.
That I'm following up on. Yeah, for anybody that is needing or still waiting on certificates of attendance, as mentioned at the kind of onset of today's webinar, we have had really wonderful problem of high interest in these webinar series and training series. So we are still catching up on getting some of those out from end of May at this point. If you haven't seen anything from me yet, please check your spam folders. The emails are being sent from our Efficiency Excellence Network email address. So that might be caught by your spam filter. So just double check there. But you can always reach out to me, and I'll put my email address in the chat here in a second.
Yeah, and we'll continue to do more trainings throughout the year. This isn't the bitter end for us all. We're going to take a little bit of a break, I think, here over the next few weeks and couple months of summer, as we all are trying to make the most out of the short summers that we get here that are beautiful, and the time that you are all in the middle of your construction season. So but that doesn't mean that if you have questions and topics that come up as you're starting to put things into practice here in those weeks and months ahead, please do reach out either directly to me, call our code assistance hotline to get some assistance there. And then also, the feedback, again, as Brendan noted, is great. We're happy to dig into any specific topic area in more detail. I'm always creating new content and have some more content that developing for future sessions that will start to roll out again here, getting into just kind of some more topic specific components of this. It's relating to the code, but maybe a little bit more into detail about putting components of the building together, and some more information sharing about the bigger picture here, the building system approach to things. So certainly appreciate and look forward to the feedback. We'll do sessions both in person and webinars again as well, and try to mix it up as we continue forward.
And Jim has a question.
Mr. Bradley?
Steve, more so an update, just in case some of those are out there that are concerned about the rulemaking and legislative process as far as RBES is concerned. Just very quickly, yesterday there was a meeting at LCAR, and LCAR was, a year ago, back in 2023 of June 2023, they suspended the adoption, fully implementation, I should say, of the RBES 2023 at that time, because there were some, real concerns that the AIA raised, and also builders raised through the VBRA and other stakeholders, that some of these things that were being put forth we weren't ready for prime time yet, and that they wanted to allow the legislative process to happen this past year through different bills. And one of those was S 253, and then Act 151 is what it came out to be, to allow for corrective measures and better allowances for people to comment and make changes necessary for Vermont's building industry. What came out of that, it was actually the allowance for instead of that we must adopt every current version of IECC that's released, that it, instead of shall adopt, it changed to may adopt, which means, the rest of New England, most of New England is actually on the 2018 code, with a few states varying a little bit. And we're now going to be on the 2024 code, without the difference being these other states have licensure, have educational opportunities, and for builders and everything else, where we don't have that on a large scale. People here are doing the great due diligence to learn more about what's going on with RBES. The vast majority of builders are not. And so, but yet they're liable for it. If they don't follow the code, they're going to be on the hook for things that don't perform well and where they miss things. And so that was a big fundamental change. But also that they were going to develop this working group, not a study group, but a working group that had their first meeting yesterday after the LCAR meeting, strangely enough. And it's all about compliance, increasing compliance with builders for new homes, and also for greater awareness. So these other builders, I mean, there's a well-known builder that I know in this area in Chittenden County that has been following the code for 2020. And when asked, well, what are you doing about these changes coming up on July 1st? And he said, what do you mean? What changes? And so there's just a big lack of, outreach to the builders and understanding of what we're learning here over these last 6 sessions. And so that's what this working group is going to be working towards, and that it's going to be for a 2-year period. But in November 15th, there's supposed to be a report out with the first round of recommendations and alterations to the RBES code, which is great. The other consideration is the fact that, as of July 1st, everybody here that's building new homes in Vermont is going to be responsible for the requirements of RBES 2024. But as noted previously in this session, there's no handbook available, and there is no actual written code materials that a builder can get their hands on and study. One of the points that were brought up yesterday by the Public Service Board when asked by LCAR as to why these materials, after delaying things for a year, were not already in print and made ready for builders to be, studying up on this new curriculum. They said that it's just was been too complicated, too convoluted to actually wade through everything and get everything ready for prime time, basically. And yet, as builders and architects, we're supposed to know as of July 1st all the ins and outs, and that we're going to be responsible for. And it's an unfortunate situation, really. So attending meetings like this is great. And for your other colleagues and associates out there, I would do whatever you can to direct them to the website, and I would do whatever you can to share with them what you've learned here, because that's really, the onus is upon us as a building community, much more than from a government agency. They can go ahead and make the rules. They can print them hopefully soon, but yet getting that word out, we just being, responsible individuals, I think we need to do our best efforts to make people aware of these things to help avoid, liability in the future, but also building failures or people being sick in these houses that have problems because people aren't following code issues that are sound and safe. So I just wanted to add that to the discussion to let everyone know what's going on, and know that there's going to be future changes this coming year and the year thereafter with alterations to RBES, because the working group with different stakeholders throughout the state are offering their input on how to best move forward. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Jim. And
Sure.
Great to have that context available here to your awareness. So it's just something that, to be aware of, that there is this ability to contribute to the direction that we're going on this, and to have more of a stake in the game of how this code works and what it means to comply and access to information. We do a lot, I think, on our end, and Bryn is a great facilitator and coordinator of making all this happen, and we put out as much content as we possibly can to support, and appreciate that everyone shows up to these as you do. And we'd just love to expand that audience as much as possible. And so your voices certainly have a huge weight to carry when we're talking about getting messages back to the policy folks that actually provide and create this content. So appreciate that context, Jim.
Sure thing. Oh,
I wanted to jump in. This is Bill.
Hi, Bill.
Hey, I want to just echo a big thumbs up to Jim. I totally support everything he said. But I just want to add, as a mechanical contractor, you really have some leverage with these projects because first, they need you, and second, they can't find anybody else in many situations. And you just have to insist on following the code or doing better and bringing everyone to the table. And I would say, especially the electrician, because without a good electrical plan, lots of other things go wrong.
Yep.
When you mix
Well,
wires with ventilation ductwork, you run into all kinds of compromise. So I was just an advocate for leadership from every trade to insist on communications and planning together. And thanks very much
yeah.
for today. Very good.
Thanks, Bill.
Thanks,
Well, yeah,
Bill.
to me, the undercurrent of all this is that there are standards of practice here that are consequential, and the foundation of the energy code beyond the policy related items and, things that have been, challenging over the years. It really comes down to the application of building science and getting durable, safe, healthy buildings built for your clients as business owners, and also to protect you as a business owner as well from future liability. So that's really the undercurrent to all this, and to me, the impetus to be curious and to pay attention to what these standards require, whether or not, regardless of there being some mandatory measure in place that says you have to do this. It's really in your best interest to be digging into these details and trying to put as much of it into practice as you can. So appreciate that point, Bill. And then just one last thing to know in the question, there was a question about do we now need to prep for battery storage, even though most PV installations in Vermont are net metered? There's another point option in the code for prescriptive compliance. You can earn a point for having battery storage installed in the home for PV. It is not in any way aligned as being a mandatory requirement to do so for now, or maybe it will be in the future, but I still think most and the majority of our PV systems being installed in the state are net metered. There were some things that happened and was some passage of some new rules or allowances by the Public Utility Commission recently that do impact the net metering and some things that the utilities have been advocating for. So I'm not going to get into that into detail here, but just something to be aware of as you're doing net metered installations in the future too, that there's some changes on the horizon in regard to how that net metering is accounted for to consumers. But no mandatory need for battery storage at this point. Again, it's just a points option for prescriptive compliance.
And there are some additional questions and requests around the handbook and recordings. I really can't emphasize enough that people go to the Efficiency Vermont Energy Code Support webpage. There are hyperlinks from there to the Public Service Department, to the ICC. That is where you'll find links to the recordings for our Energy Code webinars for the 2020 Energy Code, so archived Energy Code, which is effective until July 1st, as well as adding these 2024 RBES webinar recordings and slide decks as we can get those loaded. It may be a couple weeks before we get this one posted because of the holiday break, but it will be there in the near future. As far as the handbook goes, we mentioned that the handbooks will be available as soon as we get the copy back from our copy editor and designer. So that is where it is. It's through draft. A new building science chapter was added, which is about 30 plus pages worth of content. So that added a significant amount to the handbook for this round, which is contributing to the longer time needed to do the copy editing and design work to make it as legible and useful as possible for users once it gets into a digital copy and a printed copy. So that is that's what stage of development that is, and is urgently and feverishly being worked on as we speak. So we will let folks know when those are ready. We will send notices out, email notices out, when both digital and hard copies are available.
All right. Well, thank you, Bryn, for everything you've done to make this happen for all of us. And thank you everyone again for being here and sticking with us. And again, to those troopers who've been here for the last 6 sections, we appreciate your commitment. And please stay in touch. We enjoy doing this work, and hope to talk to you soon.
Thanks, everyone.